Welcome to the 8th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford, and today we have an interview with Joe Lansdale, author of many award-winning novels, short stories, and comic books, and also the author of the forthcoming novel Vanilla Ride, which will be published by Knopf on June 30th. Welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast. Today my guest is Joe Lansdale, the Mojo storyteller. Lansdale has been publishing short stories and novels since the late 70s. His many stories and novels, often infused with the East Texas region where he lives, have won many awards, including 7 Bram Stoker Awards. His novel, The Bottoms, won the Edgar Award for Best Novel from the Mystery Writers of America. His most recent short story collection, Sanctified and Chicken Fried, was recently published by the University of Texas Press. And Lansdale's most recent novel, Vanilla Ride, the latest in a series of novels featuring Hap Collins and Leonard Pine, will be published by Knopf on June 30th. Joe, welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Sure. So I'll just jump into some questions that I have for you. Vanilla Ride, which will be published in a few weeks, is your latest novel featuring Hap and Leonard. I wonder what keeps drawing you back to those two characters and what appeals to you about them.
I think for me, they are the epitome of East Texas, and Hap is so much like me, at least his past is so much like me in many ways that it's a natural for me. When I discovered those characters in the late 80s, when I wrote what was supposed to be a standalone book, I found that 2 or 3 years later I was coming back to them, and I've just been with them ever since, at least off and on.
Sure. And I wondered, Robert E. Howard grew up in a small Texas town and achieved success in publishing, pretty much starting out with zero contacts in the publishing world. And I also recently interviewed James Reesner, who also grew up in a small Texas town. And
I know James. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he grew up reading pulp adventure stories and now is a very successful writer. And you also grew up in rural Texas and have written in a wide variety of genres. Do you think there's something in the water in those small towns in Texas?
Seems that. Believe what it is that there's a loneliness and an emptiness in small town East Texas or Texas, at least back then. It's a little less so now because people have so many ways to be in touch with the rest of the world. But at that time, we didn't have the internet, and there wasn't 24-hour news, and there wasn't all that going on. So you had to entertain yourself. You had to use your imagination. And if you were inclined towards creative interest, you might be someone who didn't fit in with a lot of the people around, a lot of good people, but they were a lot more down-to-earth, day-to-day people. And a lot of creative people had that sucked out of them until they became purely day-by-day people. And like I said, many of those good people, good, honest work. But for those of us who, I guess, like James Reesner, for myself, Bill Kreider, another one that's from Texas that I would think of, and Bob Howard, of course, I think that it was such a passion inside of us that we either compartmentalized it or just created our own universe in which to exist. And that place mixed with all kinds of influences, comic books. Comic books were probably my earliest big influence, old movies, and then, of course, I read Rudyard Kipling and Mark Twain, and when I discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs, from that point on, I knew what I had to do.
Great. And I wonder, as I mentioned earlier, you've published a number of short story collections, the latest being Sanctified and Chicken Fried, and right. I wondered, in some of those collections, some of the stories overlap, and I wondered if you'd ever considered with Subterranean publishing kind of a definitive multi-volume collection of all of your stories, similar to what they're doing right now with Robert Silverberg.
Yeah, we discussed it. I think that we're probably going to do a best of in about 4 years or something like that, because by then I'll have a tremendous number of new short stories that are out. And a number of those, I think, are among my best work. And so we'll probably at least do a volume or 2 volume of the best. And then maybe a few years from that, I feel like I'm still young in my career, but A few years from that, we'll probably see about doing that retrospective, and a lot of things that have overlapped too. People say, well, you did this book, but this book's got some of the same stories. And my answer to that is, yeah, but the old book is completely sold out and there are new readers.
Sure.
So I want to give new readers the opportunity to read those same stories, and I always try to put something different or new in a collection so that people can find something they might not have found, or arrange it in such a way where stories that were not available before are available there. But I think what a lot of people, especially collectors, forget is that I don't just write for them. I write for me, and I also write for the new readers who come along that don't have some of the earlier short story collections about them because they're
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know you have, in your career, published both short stories and novels and even comic books. I wondered, as you've written in so many different forms, is there one that you enjoy more than the other?
Well, I've also written screenplays, and I've written animated Batman, Superman, things like that. But I'd have to say short stories are hands down my favorite thing. And then after that, novels. And then after that, probably it's kind of a toss-up. I've also written plays and had a couple of plays performed, one in Off-Broadway last year. But I really find that short stories and novels are more satisfying. And I enjoy writing comics and scripts and things like that, but it would have to be 1, 2, and then the rest of those lumped together as 3.
Sure. And you still work on short stories between novels at this point? How does that work in terms of your...
I do. I don't really have a set way of doing it. It's just that sometimes a short story will come to me and even when I'm writing a novel, and I may find that I'll squeak it out somewhere by taking a short break. And though I generally write 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, once in a while something will be so strong that I might come in the afternoon or at night and play with it until it develops. And I may be writing the novel during the day and then find that I'm writing this short story. But most of the time, the short stories that I write, the same thing, 3 hours in the morning, 5 days a week, and when I get those done, I go to the novel. But time to time, I take a break and do that. And, of course, there's things in there where I write articles. I still do a lot of nonfiction and essays and screenplays and things of that nature. And I just wrote some animated film stuff for Warner.
And what was that? Was that using a existing character?
I did a Swamp Thing straight to DVD film, animated. That I'm not sure exactly when that comes out. And then I did a 10-minute Jonah Hex animated piece that's supposed to be, if I understood this right, on the DVD of the Jonah Hex movie when it comes out on DVD.
Gotcha. I'm curious, from reading your various introductions to your short story collections over the years, and as we've already discussed, you grew up in rural Texas and you struggled to achieve your goals as a writer. I'm curious, now that you've achieved many of those goals, what drives you today when you sit down at your computer each morning to write?
Well, the goals are there, that's of course, and I get new goals. But the thing that drives me, the same thing that's always driven me, I love doing this. I love being a storyteller. I really do what I do. I would do it if I didn't get paid, although I surely love getting paid. And I'm always concerned about that part of it because I'm a professional writer and I pay my bills, I take care of my family, and I make a doing this, so I have to keep that in mind. But still, I write what I want to do, every time I sit down, even if it's something people say, well, that seems strange. For some reason, I thought, this is a challenge, this is different. And even in times when I've written something when I needed the money, and I did some pen name work and things when I did the money, I still gave it my best shot within the time limits and constrictions and restrictions of a particular project. But most of that kind of things I did early in my career, and I'm pretty much at a point now where I kind of do what I want to do and have been at that point for probably 20 years.
Great. And I'm curious, you've mentioned in interviews your appreciation and admiration for many books that could be categorized as Southern literature, Flannery O'Connor, yes. To Kill a Mockingbird. And at the same time, you've also expressed your passion and interest in pulp and genre writers ranging from Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, and many crime novelists. I wondered if it was intentional on your part to try to create a combination of those two strands of literature and your own stories and novels, kind of infusing crime and horror stories with regional flavor.
Well, I don't think that it was conscious of me at first. I think that what happened with me is just that when I started out writing, I felt that the stories they just weren't working for me. And then I had to pay attention to my surroundings, and I began to use that as my background. And by doing that, the stories begin to work better for me. I mean, I still write the occasional story that's non-East Texas, but the largest percentage of them are. And even the non-East Texas, in the same way that I would say Robert D. Howard, even when he wrote about Conan, he was writing about Texas. He was writing about Texas, and he was writing about Texans. He may have given them a little glitz and some dying cities and things like that and beautiful princesses, but they were still oil field workers and prostitutes and all the things that he had grown up around or knew about. So I think in some ways you never get away from that. But when it began to work for me is when I consciously began to put those things in. In some ways, unconsciously, I just decided I was going to write about my place and time, and then the genres begin to blend. And I always was somebody who might read Edgar Rice Burroughs one day and Hemingway the next. I learned that from Philip Jose Farmer.
Stay tuned, and we'll have more of our interview right after this.
The Kindle Chronicles is a Friday audio podcast all about the Amazon Kindle e-reader. I'm Len Edgerly, and each week I present Kindle news, tech tips, an interview, a quote, and listener comments. I've been a writer all my life, and I'm doing this podcast because the Kindle has simply renewed my love of reading. I hope you'll stop by for a listen. You can find me at thekindlechronicles.com or by searching for Kindle in the podcast area of the iTunes Store.
I wonder, do you have any specific advice for aspiring writers who may be listening to this interview and wondering?
It's pretty much the same advice I give all the time, is just that you have to read a lot and you have to have regular time to work. You need to put your ass in a chair and write. And that's the best advice I can give anybody.
Sure. And I think that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that you are a working writer, and I wonder, there's a lot of discussion, I would say, definitely, on many blogs and also in trade journals as well, Publishers Weekly, about kind of the current state of book publishing, the rise of ebooks with Amazon's Kindle and the Sony Reader. I wonder, what from your perspective as a working writer, if you have any thoughts about kind of where book publishing is now and where it may be headed in the future.
Well, this is kind of complex to answer in a short, spurt, and of course it's only my opinion, and I'm sure, I don't have all of the answers or the facts or whatever, but my take on it is that publishing was never meant to be as large as it became. There have never been that many readers. It's always been a select group. When I was growing up, there was no one that read like I did, and it wasn't until I started later in life going to conventions and meeting other people who had the same passion and fanaticism as I did. But what happened is, I think in the 1980s, and I think this was Stephen King, and I don't mean that for anything against him. It's just the way it happened. Sure. It wasn't his fault. But I believe he became so popular, and there was they saw that these bestsellers could move way beyond the Arthur Haley airplane novels and stuff like that, which were huge bestsellers at their time. A lot of genre fiction was considered the backbone of these publishers, and then the bestsellers were a gleeful surprise, but then it allowed them to publish a lot of unusual fiction, things that they didn't really make a lot of money on, and the point was to get a profit. But when this came along, everybody decided that they wanted to go like same way Hollywood was doing after Jaws and Star Wars, is they wanted the blockbuster novel mentality. And so as they did that, it began to shrink the mid-list, and the backbone that had made all the publishing work began to fall apart. And they tried to make publishing this big industry, which it really, I don't think, can support and never could. And what I think you're seeing is just a natural correction of things and bringing it back to a smaller business. It used to be family business. It used to be businesses that made a profit, but they weren't multi-million-dollar businesses. And when a lot of these companies bought them, they tried to market books the same way they do toilet paper or paper towels. They would try to create a brand name bestseller writer, and every one of them tried to have one, or and that's what they wanted. If they had their druthers, they would have had 10 writers for every house that were bestsellers and 10 in the wings that were about to be bestsellers. And so a lot of that, I think, happens. So I think you had a lot of self-correction. I think you're having a lot of self-correction now because the market can't bear that kind of thing very well. Things of that nature. I think that is a new way books are going to go for some of the younger readers that are coming up, although we're not producing enough readers. But again, I say, and I'll emphasize it, never been that many readers, really, not dedicated readers. You can't choose the fact that somebody can read makes them a reader, nor can you say that somebody that buys every book that some best-selling writer puts out one every year also reads everybody else. They may not. Readers like me may read bestsellers, they may read cross-genre, they may read classics. So what's happening is all of this is just self-correcting, and by putting it on ebooks, I think it might make it available to a new generation of readers who might not have read it. It's still a story, and that's what it is. People want stories, no matter how they're delivered. Whatever delivery system doesn't make that much difference. My choice is I prefer books. I don't think books are in any fear of disappearing, but I think that they are in fear of downsizing, because a lot of the Barnes and Noble who bought out and killed a lot of these smaller companies or smaller bookstores by cutting the prices so much, now have decided to raise their prices, but people don't want to pay that. They're used to paying lesser prices. So you're starting to have all of these things come together in one configuration that's going to cause I think, a massive change in the book business and the way that writers make money. Writers used to, when I was a kid, even writers I liked, famous writers, most of them had jobs or make an occasional living. And I mean, I've made such a good living. I'm someone who might, be hurt by that particular change in the market. But my honest belief is that's what's happening. We're having a self-correction. It's going back to what it was sort of meant to be in the first place.
That's interesting.
Scary, huh?
That's interesting. I hadn't heard it exactly articulated the way that you just did. I think you can really see that. In my opinion, you can really see that these days in the science fiction and fantasy genres, because you're starting to see a number of small presses who are becoming, larger presses absolutely. You have Subterranean Press, which to my take, even though it's a small press in one way, it publishes a large number of books. It pays writers a decent wage. They don't publish in large numbers, but when I was really starting my career, places like Doubleday in genre fiction, they only published 3,000 copies. And if they might reprint and they might not. If they sold 3,000 copies overnight, they might consider reprinting. And a large percentage of that went to library sales. So when they did this, and they tried to tie all these books into this momentum of the movies and the momentum of great bestsellers like Stephen King, and they tried to make every book a bestseller, and they marginalized the book for their back. These companies have started to collapse, or they've started to have so much money invested that they just really cannot get return on. And so I think what you're going to see is that happening, is it self-correcting, as I said. The other thing that would help, that would make this a far more viable industry, is that if you couldn't monopolize the industry. I mean, even the place I work for, Random House, and I'm very happy with my publishers, Knopf, Vintage, they're just great. But you look at it, they own probably at least a third, if not more, of the publishing business. And what used to be is that when you go out and want to sell a book, you could go to several different places. Now if you go to, say, Random House, or you go to some of these other houses that own a bunch of different companies, you're really only going to one place, because they're not going to compete against themselves. They might like a book and feel it belongs in another section, but one section turns it down, it's unlikely another section is going to buy it. It's not that it never happens, but it's not likely, because that's one book company. Back when they had all these book companies, it was different. But writers back in the 60s, the 70s, and really the early 80s,
we're getting very little money for their books. I'm not saying that's a good thing, and I'm not saying I would like it to go back to absolutely that position, but I'm saying that that's what people forget. The kind of money that writers are getting paid now is tremendous. And one thing that caused that too was the fact that a lot of the companies have very inaccurate royalty statements. So they paid you a small amount, and they might keep that book in print for years. Like Philip K. Dick at Ace Books ended up, they sued, and he got some money. I think it was a class suit for a lot of people at Ace. But that was because now, so writers say, well, if I'm not going to get royalties, I've got to get bigger advances. So as you get bigger advances, if a book collapses or doesn't do as well as expected, then that writer's career can be damaged, harmed, or put aside. You have now computers, which have caused even more problems, because if they look at the computer and the store, and they're going to order books, and they say, oh, this only sold 3,000 copies, they don't stop to think that this might be a short story collection that only had 3,000 copies and therefore did quite well, or 10,000 copies, whatever, or that it was a small press, like, say, Subterranean or something, and they sold only 3,000 copies because they only printed 3,000 copies. So a lot of these things have harmed the way people buy books, because they're no longer bought on the basis of, like, this looks like a good book that people would want. Everything is computerized, and so you don't always get a fair shake or a fair accounting of what it is that you've actually achieved. And the other thing, too, is that people can look at the computer and say, well, he sold this much, I'm not going to buy these books because he doesn't sell. Well, it never comes into their mind that possibly the reason that writer didn't sell the other was their own books to sell, or that they got poor marketing, or that nothing was done properly with the books. There can be so many multiple of reasons that are now just boiled down to a number on a computer.
Sure.
That's probably a lot more than you actually wanted to hear.
No, I think you definitely have an interesting perspective, and I think a lot of what you're saying is absolutely true. So I think a lot of people will be interested in hearing that. And you've talked several times about the amount that aspiring writers should read, and how much you read growing up. I wonder who you're reading now.
Still read. Mm-hmm. I read everybody. Obviously, if I read a writer and I don't like their work, I don't continue reading them. But I read a lot of different people. I read a lot of older books. I'm rereading James Cain's Postman Rings Twice right now because I'm writing a little piece on James Cain in that book. But I read a Robert Parker book just the other day. I was dipping into Flannery O'Connor's short stories. I often go back and pick up books that I've read, like Hemingway's books or Fitzgerald's books or Faulkner's books, and I may read a chapter from them or a section I like, not to mention the fact that I'm constantly buying and reading new books. I love all the classic writers of horror, like Robert Bloch, and Ray Bradbury when he was his horror stage, and I like his other stuff pretty well too. Well, there's always somebody I'm reading. The last thing I read before that was a collection of short stories by Ray Bradbury, because We'll Always Have Paris, which was a totally different kind of story than you normally think of from Bradbury, at least for the most part. A very good collection. It's his last collection, probably some older material. So I'm always looking for things that excite me and interest me.
Sure.
And I read comic books too, same thing.
What are some of the comics you're reading these days?
Well, I can tell you what I read the last step. I read the collection of Turok, Son of Stone, which was from the 60s when I was a kid. I think maybe some of it might have even been from the 50s, because I started reading it when I was very young, and I read them whenever I could get my hands on them. And so it was the collection of those old comics. And I read a lot of the old collections, like from DC. I'll buy the old Flash or the old Green Lantern. And then I read some of the new things, too. I'm trying to think of the one I read that I really liked. They actually made a film out of it, a DVD animated film. It was about the Justice League's formation. New Frontier, I think is what it was called.
Gotcha.
And
gotcha.
Yeah, and I really loved that. And I've read a lot of comics lately that, I've pretty well forgotten. I read the first 25 of the New Spirit at DC and enjoyed those, but felt I'd had enough of those for a while. So,
Sure.
I still read a lot of comics, and I read a lot of books, and I read a lot of short stories, which was my favorite form.
Great. I wondered what's on the horizon for you beyond your new novel, Vanilla Ride, which will be published in a few weeks. Any new short stories or novels scheduled beyond that?
Yeah. There's a number of short stories coming out. There's different kinds of short stories coming out. There's a new story right now on the Subterranean Press online magazine that's a pure Western. It's called Hides and Horns. And it's a character that I've thought of writing in a novel for many years and just never have. And another story, a straight Western story, is coming out in Garden of Bourgeois and George R.R. Martin's Warriors next year. And I have Ellen Datlow has a collection coming out, an anthology coming out with a story of mine called The Folding Man, which is an old-fashioned, almost pulp nut horror story. I just wrote a couple of mainstream-type stories for some anthologies. So I'm always got these going, and I'm starting a new Hap and Leonard novel here pretty soon.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us, and I really appreciate it. And so thanks for joining us for our conversation with Joe Lansdale. As I've said,
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to our feed in iTunes, or you could leave a review of this podcast on iTunes. And if you'd like to leave a voicemail, we can include your audio comment in a future episode of the podcast. The voicemail line is 206-888-2731. Again, that's 206-888-2731. Thanks again for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with another interview with a writer that you enjoy reading.
With MailChimp, you get a whole lot more than a URL. You get an all-in-one marketing platform to help drive sales. That means you can connect your data to make more informed, smarter decisions, and you get powerful automation tools like our Customer Journey Builder to ensure you never miss an opportunity to turn shoppers into loyal customers. So if you're ready to integrate your marketing and boost sales, get started today at MailChimp.com/smartmarketing. MailChimp, built for growing businesses.
You promise your child they can be anything they choose. They promise to follow their dreams. Our promise is to help you save for college today and every day worry-free. YouPromise.com lets you save extra money for college by doing the everyday things you already do. Link any college savings plan with the free YouPromise account and watch your child's dreams become their future. Sign up today at YouPromise.com for a $30 welcome bonus. Start now at YouPromise.com.